These days, fantasy and sarcasm tend to become reality, don't they? It's so hard to tell what's real and what's not anymore. The past, the present, it's all in flux when you consider how the world works now. There are some of us who can thrive in this chaos, and others who lose touch. They fall upon dark paths, ones which they may never be able to return from, which is what brings me to the twisted tale of the Mario murders. Riley Lambert was born in the late 90s. He was an only child and never really seemed to fit in with the other kids his age. His parents seemed to act like he was God's gift to man, though, and that belief system underlied everything that he did. As a child, when he would be invited to other kids' birthday parties, he expected all the attention. In fact, it was like that pretty much everywhere that he went. As you'd probably assume, going out into the world with this kind of mentality didn't help him make friends. He would leave other kids' houses disappointed, each and every time, confused as to why they didn't want to play with him. When he would return home to his parents, though, he was always welcomed with some kind of a present to mend his sorrows, one which he would apathetically accept. And usually, it was a video game. See, over the years, Riley got very into video games, extremely into them. In gaming, he could play in a world where everything was all about him, and no one could take that away. Having parents like his, he got all the best too. Yet there was nothing that rivaled the Mario games. The reason these appealed to him so much was probably the fact that Mario always got the princess in the end. It was a world which he saw as just, one where you were given what you deserved. Another thing about Riley was that he actually turned out to be a pretty good-looking guy, the tall, dark, and handsome type, yet he always had problems with women. In fact, by the age of 21, he had still never even kissed a girl. This mentally tortured him, and as a guy who thought the world of himself, it drove him to the absolute edge. He stopped going to classes, and instead hung around campus watching girls as they'd leave. Eventually, he started following them home and spent hours outside their places. Most of the time, he had his Nintendo Switch with him, and he'd play Super Mario Odyssey in the car as the time passed. He came to know who their friends and boyfriends were, when they'd walk their dogs, what they did for fun, anything that could help him understand who they were and how he could make them his. Myuu was his favorite of all the girls he followed. She was gorgeous, blue-eyed, wavy blonde hair. Actually, she looked kind of like Princess Peach. Soon after finding her, he pretty much stopped following the others. One night after she got out of class, he followed her to a frat party. While driving, they got to a red light together, and she recognized his car from earlier that day. As he pulled up down the street, he caught a glimpse of Myuu pointing at him from behind her car. Her boyfriend and several of his friends charged out and surrounded Riley. They then proceeded to give him the beating of his life, smashing his face onto the pavement countless times. Riley woke up later in the hospital, with his head covered in bandages. After unraveling them in the mirror, he witnessed a face he didn't recognize. It was horrifically disfigured beyond recognition, with massive keloid scars across his face and a shockingly crooked nose. Doctors told him that there were options for plastic surgery in the future, but that he'd probably never look quite the same again. The damage was just too severe. His face was not the only thing that was broken beyond repair, though. Where before he had hoped for a future beyond struggles with women, Riley had now lost all hope. He tried pressing charges against the frat boys, but their parents' rich lawyers pretty much stopped him from getting any justice that way. Years passed, and eventually Riley moved into a studio in an old industrial complex on the rundown side of town, one where he knew no one would ever go visit him. He for the most part stopped speaking to anyone at that point. Anytime anybody would try to contact him, he'd just say he was busy working on a project. Over the coming months, strange things began happening around Riley's complex. A neighbor's cat turned up dead one day, crushed beyond recognition. And the weird thing was that it wasn't even in the street. It was just up on the neighbor's porch, flattened. This happened a couple more times before one night a neighbor's door was smashed in, and a woman was savagely murdered inside. Once again, the murder occurred in a kind of strange way. Her skull and limbs had been crushed onto the kitchen floor. The other odd thing was, leading away from the body, there were these large bloody shoe prints, which eventually vanished as they approached the front door. Aside from that, detectives had nothing to go on, though. No one had any reason to want to kill the woman, and from what they could tell, this was a premeditated, targeted attack, so the case went cold fairly quick. However, similar attacks began to spring up around the city. It was always a random break-in and then savage beating, all with large shoe prints leading away from the area. Police began to notice another trend in many of the killings too. Each of them seemed to have gone to the same college, and were even in the same fraternity together. Before long, the police had tied many of the killings back to the incident where Riley had been beaten up in the parking lot during the frat party. After this realization, they quickly got a warrant to search Riley's studio, and what they found was truly bizarre. He wasn't home, and his front door wasn't even closed. It was like he'd left and wasn't planning on going back. Then, along with mountains of workout equipment, the police found several disturbing items throughout the studio. The first was a sectioned off area of the room where Riley had appeared to have been practicing crushing bones, testing different sizes and the strength required to break them. On his computer, the police also found numerous folders with research about many of the murder victims, like where they worked, home addresses, etc. It was what they discovered next to the computer, though, that was the most alarming. Printed out were plans for some kind of suit, sitting next to a sewing machine, along with several steel molds behind it. The police quickly realized it wasn't for just some costume either. It was a complete kill suit. The diagram showed a red shirt and blue pants lined with Kevlar, and these white steel glove pieces that went with it. Then there were these large brown shoes fashioned from leather and steel, with a red newsboy hat. Very worried, the police put out an APB on Riley, and already had an idea of who his next victim would probably be. Mia, who was the last person from the frat party attack that was still alive. She had recently moved to a 2-story house in the wooded area of the suburbs with her husband. After eating dinner that night, her and her husband were heading off to bed when they heard this weird, quick laugh from outside the house. Her husband went outside with a bat to check, and after a few minutes, Mia heard him scream in agony. She quickly looked out her bedroom window and saw the shadow of a large man leaning over her husband's body, feasting on his remains. The man stood up and gazed toward her from the shadows, holding these strange boxing glove type fists where his hands were supposed to be. She immediately ran to call the cops, and by the time she grabbed her phone, there were already the sounds of massive steel fists pounding against her door. After 3 or 4 hits, the door completely crashed in. Mia then hid in a closet at the top of her stairs as she heard the clunking of giant metal boots entering the house. "Hello?" she heard echo from the front of the house. Panicked, Mia ran down the stairs and toward the kitchen to grab a knife. The man chased after her, his shoes smashing down against the wood floor, chipping and cracking it. As soon as she picked up the knife, one of the fists smashed into the wall beside her. She spun around, stabbing the man multiple times, but nothing would go through his shirt, and the knife eventually got stuck. Taking off running, she made it to the hallway before feeling a massive impact against her back, knocking her to the floor. She rolled over, struggling to breathe, and looked up at the man pursuing her. She recognized it was Riley, his gruesome, disfigured face reflecting off the light of the kitchen. He was dressed like a twisted version of Super Mario, with a mustache and hat and everything. Only it wasn't perfect, it was like a makeshift version, which added to the terror. For a brief moment, he almost seemed as if he felt bad, but then as blood trickled out of his mouth, he said the words, "It's me!" He jumped and smashed down on her legs with his steel shoes. She screamed in agony, trying to crawl away. He kept pursuing her, lifting and smashing his shoes down onto her side, over and over. Then he raised his giant fist in the air above her head, but before he could hit her, shots rang out through the house. At least a full clip was unloaded into Riley before he fell to the ground. Stunned and in a fit of rage, he leaped back up and charged towards the door at 2 police officers standing there, guns drawn. The other officer unloaded an entire clip into Riley as well, finally wounding him as he swung his fist towards the officer's head. The metal glove flew off and clanged against the floor as Riley began coughing up blood. Moments later, he was dead. In the coming weeks, Mia made a full recovery, and countless news outlets hounded her for the story every chance they got. "Man in Mario Killsuit Murders College Bullies" was the main headline you saw everywhere for at least a few days. At least until something crazy happened somewhere else. However, a few months later, somehow the plans for Riley's suit were leaked online and started being downloaded like crazy. Since then, several other people have attempted to build the suit, along with designing them for their own characters as well. As I said before, we live in a world where it seems like just anything can happen. But just because it can, definitely does not mean that it should.